Levittown was built, Americans have decried the banal horrors of suburbia. Perhaps there's something about the mass production of similar houses that reminds us of a hive and hints at a hive mind forming. Aerial photographs of these classic post-war housing developments highlight their architectural monotony, and for some reason we fear that boring places can make us boring, that a landscape carpet-bombed with little houses made of ticky-tacky will force us to be all the same. Disaffected refugees from suburbia gleefully proclaim its evils: consumerism, conformism, racism. You only need to glance at contemporary culture to see the sneers embodied in the work of David Lynch, James Howard Kunstler, Mike Davis, movies like The Truman Show, the list goes on. Yet if you look at the numbers, most of us live in or hail from the middle landscape that is suburbia. Green but not rural, full of shops but definitely not urbane. This is home. Home to so many human hearts beat in the suburbs. How could they be as hollow as intellectuals and artists are so eager to say? Look again at the places written off as placeless. You may find a lot more than you expected. This is perhaps the most important thing that D.J. Waldie's work as a writer calls to our attention. His 1996 book, Holy Land, a suburban memoir, winner of the California Book Award, is a multivalent narrative broken into 316 fragments of varying length. Waldie's story of growing up is interspersed with the history of the town of Lakewood, its oddball creators, the teams of workers who built the place so quickly, the teams of salespeople who sold them to couples like Waldie's parents. Holy Land walks calmly past the platitudes against suburbia and finds instead people. People living the best lives they know how, not quite middle-class lives, as Waldie describes them, in little houses spaced just 15 feet apart. Joan Didion says Holy Land is infinitely moving and powerful, just dead on right, and absolutely original. D.J. Waldie's other books include Where We Are Now, a book of essays about Los Angeles, California Romantica and Home, 2 books on architecture organized by actress Diane Keaton. And he wrote vivid, evocative text to accompany the photographs in Real City, a beautiful documentation of downtown LA commissioned by the Los Angeles Public Library's Neighborhood Project. Waldie's flair for brief and piercing insights pairs particularly well with photography, and you can find an essay by him introducing a book of intriguing found snapshots called Close to Home. In addition to books, Waldie contributes to KCET's ongoing place-based reportage by way of a blog on their site, and his writings have appeared in the Los Angeles Times, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and many other publications. Ladies and gentlemen, D.J. Waldie.
I've asked for more light because my eyes are very bad. And you may forgive me, I hope, if I get this book rather close to my face in order to read the words of Holy Land. What a wonderful and kind introduction. Thank you so very, very much for that. As you heard, Holy Land is made up of bits. They're numbered bits. They're numbered rather like the addresses of houses on a block. I'm going to read some of them, some bits to you. Hopefully there's a bit of an arc of a story here that comes from these bits, which cover a great deal of territory, both internal and external. As I was privileged to say to students in the MFA program today who are interested in creative nonfiction, the writer's work is digging, and digging and excavating into the world in which the writer lives, both the world as it is and the world within the writer himself or herself. And because of that belief that the digging is part of what writers do, and that the world is what's dug, and the world contains both itself and the writer, these bits and pieces of excavating my past and excavating my town are both personal and, if you will, impersonal, both personal historic, both personal and almost to say geologic in some ways. But I think maybe it'll become clear as I read a few of these pieces. I'm going to start with 12. In 1949, 3 developers bought 3,500 acres of Southern California farmland. They planned to build something that was not exactly a city. In 1950, before the work of roughing the foundations and pouring concrete began, the 3 men hired a young photographer with a single-engine plane to document their achievement from the air. The photographer flew when the foundations of the first houses were poured. He flew again when the framing was done, and later when the roofers were nearly finished. He flew over the shell of the shopping center that explains this and many other California suburbs. The 3 developers were pleased with the results. The black and white photographs show immense abstractions on ground, the color of the full moon. Some of the photographs appeared in Fortune and other magazines. The developers bound enlargements in a handsome presentation book. I have several pages from one of the copies. The photographs celebrate house frames precise as cells in a hive, and stucco walls fragile as an unearthed bone. Seen from above, the grid is beautiful and terrible. 13. 4 of the young man's photographs became the definition of this suburb and then of suburbs generally. The photographs looked down before the moving vans arrived and before you and I learned to play hide and seek beneath the poisonous oleander trees. Architectural critics and urban theorists reprinted the photographs in books with names like God's Own Junkyard. 40 years later, the same 4 photographs still stand for the places in which most of us live. The photographs were images of the developers' crude pride. And they report that the grid, briefly empty of associations, is just a pattern predicting itself. The theorists and critics did not look again 40 years later to see the intersections or calculate in them the joining of interests, limited but attainable, like the leasing of chain stores in a shopping mall. 16. My father's kindness was as pure and indifferent as a certain kind of saint's. My father did not have a passion for his giving. It came from him, perhaps after much spiritual calculation, as a product might come from a conveyor belt. The houses in this suburb were built the same way. As many as 100 a day were begun between 1950 and 1952, more than 500 a week. No 2 floor plans were built next to each other. No neighbor had to stare into his reflection across the street. Teams of men built the houses. Some men poured concrete into the ranks of foundations from mixing trucks waiting in a mile-long line. Other men threw down floors nailed with pneumatic hammers, tilted up the framing, and scaled the rafters with cedar shingles lifted by conveyor belts from the beds of specially built trucks. You are mistaken if you consider this a criticism either of my father or the houses. "27. You leave the space between the houses uncrossed. You rarely go across the street, which is 45 feet wide. You are grateful for the distance. It is as if each house on your block stood on its own enchanted island, 50 feet wide by 100 feet long. People come and go from it, your parents mostly, and your parents' friends. Your parents arrive like pilgrims. But the island is remote. You occasionally hear the sounds of anger. You almost never hear the sounds of love. You hear, always at night, the shifting of the uprights, the sagging of ceiling joists, and the unpredictable ticking of the gas heater. "42. In the suburbs, a manageable life depends on a compact among neighbors. The unspoken agreement is an honest hypocrisy. Pages of ordinances in the municipal code are never enforced. They are, in fact, unenforceable. You do not need a law to keep your neighbor from walling his yard with used refrigerators. When he does, what law would have restrained him? 45. The streets of my city are a fraction of a larger grid anchored to one in Los Angeles. That grid was laid out in September 1781. The Los Angeles grid is a copy of one carried from Mexico City to an anonymous stretch of riverbank by Colonel Felipe de Neve, governor of California. The grid the Spanish colonel carried to the non-existent Los Angeles in 1781 originally came from a book in the Archive of the Indies in Seville. The book prescribed the exact orientation of the streets, the houses, and the public places for all the colonial settlements in the Spanish Americas, and that grid came from God. 46. Stop counting, Mother, I said, bending over her hospital bed, and she stopped on 3. All afternoon she had been telling numbers as she died. She kept saying, 3, 2, 5, 3, 2. I said, stop counting, Mother. She stopped counting again on 3. What were they? Were they a telephone number or a street address? They were coordinates for a map I did not have. '65. These houses went up cheaply on fields cut to stubble only hours before construction began. Veterans needed no down payment, and the Federal Housing Authority guaranteed loans at 4% interest up to 30 years. Non-veterans paid $695 down. Mortgage payments began at $46.98 a month for a 2-bedroom house and $53.50 for one with 3. 2-bedroom houses sold for $7,575. The 3-bedroom houses sold for $8,525. The first unit of the new subdivision was ready for sale in March 1950. Rows of concrete foundations surrounded the one remaining bean field where the ground had been broken for the shopping center. The developers were anxious to identify their development so remote from any city. They put up a steel oil derrick at the edge of the last field, mounted a war surplus beacon up at the top, and strung the derrick's legs with more electric lights. At night, 100 feet above the implausibly level ground, the light could be seen for miles. '72. The average age of the wives in the suburb was 26. The average age of the husbands was 32. Most families made between $4,000 and $7,000 a year. The average income was $5,100. That was $2,000 higher than the national average in 1950. My father made $4,600 that year working as a laboratory assistant for the gas company. 75% of the buyers were purchasing their first house. They used credit to buy a car and furniture. By 1953, 98% of the households had a television set. No one had any money. 73. In 1952, a reporter for the local paper interviewed an average resident of the new suburb. He lived on Hayter Street. He had a wife, a son, and a daughter. He was 32. He earned $4,400 a year, including property taxes and insurance. He paid $70 a month for his 3-bedroom house. He paid $19 a month on his new television set and $48 a month for his new furniture. His wife knew only her next-door neighbors until she joined a sewing club on her block. There she met 5 more of her neighbors. He and his wife were registered Democrats, but they had voted that November for Eisenhower. He said he and his wife were looking for a church, but they didn't know which one. They wanted to get involved in the community, he said, but they wanted to get the grass growing in their front yard first. '80. My house is largely a void. The emptiness is not just in the open span of the rooms or in the attic and foundation spaces. All the walls are hollow too. Houses in Southern California are built as sketchily as possible while still able to shed rain. Walls are a thin cement skin over absence. Roofs are important here, but only when it rains. The rest is for modesty. '93. The question really was who could be trusted to buy these small houses. Characteristically, the developers did not bother answering it. The subdivision's sales manager said in 1951, "We sell happiness in homes." His salesman sold 30 to 50 houses a day and more than 300 during one weekend when the first unit of the subdivision opened. At one point, salesmen sold 107 houses in an hour. They sold 7,400 houses in less than 10 months. Buyers needed only a steady job and the promise they would keep up the payments. '94. Sheetrock panels cover the interior walls of my house. Paint covers the plastered sheetrock. The walls have been painted white for more than 30 years. When my mother left the house to die in the hospital nearby, congestive heart failure had swelled her legs and feet and made her clumsy. She sat on the edge of her bed and could not dress herself the day she left. My father was outside readying the car. I waited in the hallway at the doorway to my room. At the last moment, she found a new fear. "Don't come in," she said to me. "I'm not covered." She called out to my father, who came to the front door. "He can't come in. He would see me," she said to him. My father came back inside to help her dress in a clean nightgown and to keep from me the sight of my mother. I was 31. After my father died, I had the rooms painted white again. '11. You and I were trained for a conflict that never came. At my grade school, the Sisters of St. Joseph made me hate communists, then intolerance, and finally everything that would break the charmed pattern of our lives. I'm not sure the Sisters of St. Joseph expected this from their daily lessons on the red thread. 112. The nun stories made me want to keep everything that I could. First, I would keep my faith. Much later, I would keep our regard for each other and the ways in which we revealed ourselves in these small houses. '68. For nearly 3 years, the pace of construction never slowed. The governing board of one church was interested in a building site for a new parish. The board members made a tentative offer to the realty agent, but they had to wait for approval from their congregation. When the congregation agreed to the price, the board members came back to buy the vacant property. They couldn't find it. New houses already covered the site they had chosen for their church. '72. The critics of suburbs say that you and I live narrow lives. I agree, my life is narrow. From one perspective or another, all our lives are narrow. Only when lives are placed side by side do they seem larger. 173. Mrs. R. and her husband lived across the street. They had a daughter born a few months before my brother. They were Episcopalians. My mother and Mrs. R. were friends. They spent afternoons in each other's houses while my mother waited through her first pregnancy. One afternoon, Mrs. R.'s baby stopped breathing. Mrs. R. came to my mother's front door in tears, helpless. Neither Mrs. R. nor my mother had a car. Neither could drive. Few women in the neighborhood could. Neither house had a telephone. My mother, heavy with her baby, ran across the street into Mrs. R.'s house. She picked up Mrs. R.'s daughter. She walked into the kitchen and turned on the faucet. She cradled the dead baby in her arm against the curve of her stomach and cupped her hand into the stream of water. With a little of the water, she baptized the baby. It was all she could do. .215. The grid limited our choices exactly as urban planners said it would, but the limits weren't paralyzing. The design of the suburb compelled a conviviality that people got used to and made into a substitute for choices, including not choosing at all. There are an indefinite number of beginnings and endings on the grid, but you are always somewhere. .221. The students at St. Timothy Lutheran School display their models of California missions in the shopping center. The models of the missions are grouped at one end of a reflecting pool. The pools replaced the landscape planters down the middle of the shopping mall when it was enclosed and air-conditioned in 1978. The students made their models out of cardboard, styrofoam, plaster, and clay. Some of the models have trees made of twigs and moss. The roofs of the models are painted red in imitation of the red tile roofs of the original mission buildings. The walls of the models are painted pink or tan, look like stuccoed adobe. The models are labeled with the name of the mission they represent: Santa Barbara, San Fernando, San Juan Capistrano, and San Luis Rey. The labels are a helpful concession because all the models look much the same. A U-shape of connected one-story rooms, a two-story church partly closing the open end of the courtyard, and a low campanile for the bells. When I was in grade school, every student in the state made a model mission as part of the required California history curriculum. Assembling one of these models when you were 8 or 9 years old made California history seem mostly about building materials. .231. Marshall Boyer, the son of one of the developers, named the new streets in the subdivision his father was building. He named Joanna Avenue for Joanna Dobkin, the daughter of his father's lawyer. He named Flangel and Frankel streets for two former schoolmates, Harold Flangel and Jerry Frankel. Boyer said he had a hard time telling them apart in school. I can assure you we still do have that problem. He named Hackett Avenue for the comedian Buddy Hackett. He named streets for movie actors Gene Herschel and Gene Autry. Streets named McKnight, Volk, McManus, Schroll honored the men who arranged the financing for his father's company. He named Gloria Street after an old girlfriend. He named De Boyer Street after his wife. Allred and Dollar Streets were named for servicemen reported missing in action in Korea. Bomberry Street was named for Sergeant Robbie Bomberry, who survived a North Korean massacre of captured American soldiers and returned home. He named Freckles Road after a dead Cocker Spaniel run over by a car. Boyer named streets Dwight, Eisenhower, Mamie, and Nixon. Because Eisenhower already had streets named in his honor in cities nearby, the county engineer directed Marshall Boyer to choose different names. Boyer was allowed to keep Nixon and Mamie. .232. Marshall Boyer considered naming streets Stevenson and Adlai, but after Eisenhower's election victory in 1952, Boyer changed his mind. .233. Robbie Bomberry's daughter, who lives in Illinois, wrote City Hall with the news of her father's death. She wanted to remind city officials that a street had been named after her father and that he had been a hero. .238. My brother and I played Monopoly with the boy across the street and the three brothers who live one block east. We would begin the game on the morning of one day. It might end after long breaks and arguments and reconciliations 2 days later in someone else's home. We made the rules up as we went along to keep the game going as long as possible. 239. When we played Monopoly, we stretched out the game by doubling the money in the bank from other sets. We let players go into debt, ignored fines, allowed players to mortgage properties to each other, and forgave rents. Late in the afternoon on the last day of one of these games, we would lose the point of playing. We moved the metal tokens around the board and realized that no one could win under these rules. By consent, the game ended when the first player was finally called to dinner. (281) It is unlawful to tell the future in my city. One of the oldest ordinances in the city code book, adopted when the city incorporated in 1954, lists the illegal practices by which the future may not be foretold. And I quote, "It is illegal to furnish any information not otherwise obtainable by the ordinary processes of knowledge, by means of any occult psychic power, faculty, or force, clairvoyance, clairaudience, cartomancy, psychology, psychometry, phrenology, spirit seership, prophecy, auguries, astrology, palmistry, necromancy, mind reading, telepathy, or by any other craft, art, science, talisman, charm, potion, magnetism, magnetized substance, gypsy cunning, or foresight, crystal gazing, or oriental mysteries." (306) There was very little that distinguished the border Southerners in my neighborhood from my father, who had grown up in Manhattan, or my mother, who had lived on Long Island and worked in New York. There was very little that distinguished any of us living here. We lived in what we were told was a good neighborhood. Our houses were nearly the same. We shopped at the same stores. We watched the same television programs. From September to June, my brother and I wore Catholic grade school uniforms of dark gray corduroy pants and light gray short-sleeved shirts. In summer, we wore white cotton t-shirts, denim pants, and high-top tennis shoes. Every boy in my neighborhood did. Our parents were anxious to do what was expected of them, even when the expectation was not altogether clear. And I'll end with the last bits from Holy Land. By this time you've understood that this is a Catholic boyhood, and the last parts of Holy Land deal with the ceremonies in the period just before Easter Sunday. And these ceremonies include a number of different things, and I will, including what I will read now. This is 3:14. On Good Friday, the services are shortened. No Mass is said. The priest and the congregation read one of the gospel accounts of the crucifixion. A narrator reads the descriptions, the priest reads the words Jesus, and other readers take the parts of Peter and Pontius Pilate. The congregation reads aloud what the crowds are supposed to have said. Near the end of the service, after the readings, the congregation participates in the veneration of the cross. Altar servers bring 3 or 4 large crucifixes from the sacristy and take them down to the first step in front of the altar. Each server holds a crucifix forward so that the feet of the figure of Jesus on the cross are in reach of someone kneeling at the first step. Another server holds a small starched square of white linen. 3:15. When I was a boy and served on Good Friday, the lines of congregants stretched to the back of the church. There was no distinction about who could participate in the veneration of the cross. Mothers and fathers stood with their small children waiting in line. They came forward, genuflected briefly on the first step in front of the altar, leaned forward and kissed the feet of the figure of Jesus on the cross. If I was holding the cross, I tried to keep it as steady as possible. If I was holding the square of starched white cloth, I was supposed to wipe the feet of the figure. I wasn't sure if this was reverence or something to do with hygiene. As the members of the congregation venerated the cross, the cloth I carried grew bright red from the lipstick I wiped from the feet of Jesus. And here is the last bit from Holy Land 3:16. While the congregation knelt and venerated the cross, the choir sang. The hymn the choir sang was Pange Lingua, a hymn traditional for Good Friday. Among its many verses are some addressed to the cross itself. Dulce lignum, dulces clavos, dulce pandus sustinet. Sweet the wood, sweet the nails, sweet the weight you bear. Thank you.